Most of us spend 40 hours or more at work. It is naive to think that mental well-being is unrelated to one's career and work environment. So how do we help clients, organizations, as well as our colleagues explore their own path to career leadership? For clients and people of color, what are the unique experiences that we must consider when thinking about the connection between mental well-being and leadership? Welcome to People of Color in Psychology, the show that explores mental health topics specific to culture, diversity, and communities of color. I am your host, Jack Tsen. Our guest today is Dr. Staci Bullard, a licensed industrial and organizational psychologist and founder of Becoming Point, a personal coaching, executive therapy, and consulting firm focused on the whole development of the leader as a person. Dr. Bullard aims to help high-performing clients deal with personal and professional issues not traditionally addressed by executive or leadership coaching programs. Dr. Bullard also ran programs for the city of Atlanta, working with men on dual diagnosis and transitioning them to the community. Currently, Dr. Bullard is working with the University of North Carolina on research with decision-making for leaders, and the important point is how to marry practitioners with scholars so that the information can be applied. Prior to her career as an IO psychologist, Dr. Bullard actually worked in human resources and in research, which has continued to inform her current work. Additionally, Dr. Bullard is a sought-after speaker and has led trainings and workshops for organizations on topics such as leadership behavioral health. As a Black IO psychologist, Dr. Bullard will be discussing leadership behavioral health for clients of color and how therapists can play a role to help their clients identify signs to start seeking executive coaching. Dr. Bullard, thank you so much for being on our podcast today and welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
So for our listeners, let's have a common vernacular. Can you share with us how you define executive coaching?
Yes, executive coaching in general is a way of working with clients really on practical technical skills, whether that be improving communication skills. Sometimes it is managing conflict, executive presence. And so executive coaching by design generally comes through some level of perhaps challenges with performance. We use it often in succession planning and preparing leaders from going from one role to the next. So it is generally heavily based on applied skills that is necessary for that person to perform well in their job or to be able to move forward vertically on the next job.
Got it. Now, you've worked with a lot of leaders, and maybe, I'm curious, how would you define leaders? Because, I think there's a general idea of what that means. People are thinking executives, like, C-suite, but some people have more of a robust, broad definition. And that way, because we're just thinking about executive coaching services, if we restrict the definition to leaders as, say, just a C-suite, that actually limits a lot of clients of color as they are advancing and progressing in an organization.
Yeah, you're right. I think that is our stereotypical kind of caricature. When we think of leaders, we tend to think of someone from middle management up C-suite. Leadership doesn't necessarily equate to title. It is really in the way one carries themselves, whether they recognize that within themselves. More often than not, sometimes that doesn't happen. For example, you have an employee on the loading dock in a company who has influence and command of a team in a way that we would recognize, they have very strong leadership skills, but that's not his day-to-day task, right? And oftentimes these hidden leaders don't necessarily get seen, especially now. And when we are working remotely or hybrid, sometimes there's a disconnect because there's not necessarily a presence of management to walk around and things of that nature and be able to pull out and see a person live in their character and how they do their day-to-day, which creates a challenge. So oftentimes we have up-and-coming leaders that we don't necessarily recognize, which means that the opportunities for them there's an opportunity gap. It creates an opportunity gap because they're not always necessarily getting that coaching that is necessary for them to be able to move their career forward if that is something that they desire. I would say that one of the most powerful phrases that you can tell a person is, have you ever considered? Because oftentimes that influences a person's professional trajectory. I often, in my time as an organizational psychologist and in HR, sometimes you are that person that plants that seed. And my worry and my concern is because of the way that we do organizations now with remote and hybrid, that has its benefits. So I can get that. The other challenges is there a trade-off because other things get lost. And that's going to be one of the things in that. As it relates to executive coaching really is reserved because of the cost, because it can be very expensive to implement. Generally for people of middle management, we don't really use executive coaching for individuals who are up and coming or who are team leads or maybe supervisors. And so there is also, again, another opportunity gap as it relates to having the appropriate resources. And when you're at the, for lack of a better word, bottom level of your leadership, totem, don't necessarily get those, and you don't necessarily know that it's okay for you to ask for that.
I'm hearing several important points, as many of our listeners are therapists, which is thinking more complexly about this idea of leadership that, as you mentioned, leadership can look like many things. In fact, you could be working, on the field. However, there is influence and posing this question, hey, have you considered what it would be like to advance, to lead? And that is separate from executive coaching in terms of resources. But at least broaching these questions so that folks on the field, or just, folks in, like you said, kind of in terms of the hierarchy of organizations, can start to consider that. So that's helpful for therapists to tune to and listen to. So share with our listeners more about what you are doing and what messages you like most of our therapists to learn about.
In the spirit of this conversation, one of the things that I have taken upon myself, because I have access to rooms that maybe the average person does not, I have access to being at the table in ways that other individuals do not. My way of contributing of how do we, do something about this opportunity gap. Yes, there is a need at the higher level, but higher performers are always throughout the organizations. And I actually, in my work, have more clients who are transitioning from one level on the hierarchy to another. And that right now is probably a good chunk of my business, and preparing them for that transition, both professionally and personally. And so one of the things that I have taken upon myself is this concept of what I call +1. And +1 means if I'm at a conference, I'm going to negotiate either in my conference fees or whatever that is to be able to bring at least one guest, and that one guest is somebody that would not have an opportunity to be in the room. Or I set aside some of my finances to be able to do so as a gift, because it's easy to say in concept, but there's something different about being able to be in the room that can be life-changing for people. So in a real practical way, as a organizational psychologist, or even as a practitioner, I have a client now who is decided that she wants to be a therapist, and that's great. And so my job is really more therapist/mentor as she is making this transition. And she's going from actually having a traditional job to a profession. And now there's where that kind of coaching goes in. And so my role is kind of nuanced. There are times when I'm actually a therapist. There's times when I'm actually a coach, and there's times when actually I'm a mentor. And so that +1 gives people access again, and it helps address that gap, but it also gives me the opportunity to work on what we've been working on in session live, giving live, feedback. So that same individual, inviting them into the room to a conference and watching them, and they sat in the back. And so now that creates an opportunity about having presence and visibility, that if you're moving to a certain position inside of a company, visibility is important, and how do we, and navigating through that. But if nobody tells you that in the moment, and that's not really where you're coming from, and your family of origin or a certain demographic, blue collar, socioeconomic, you don't know how to, navigate those things, the culture, the rules. And then also giving a chance to, after the fact, do some processing. So then also what allows me as a practitioner to really kind of use hands-on in the moment, right? It would be very similar to Mnuchin in family systems or Albert Ellis, where their practitioner is kind of in the space and not just the observer.
Yeah, that, there's so much that gets lost. I'm just thinking about our therapy work. We do so much in just the office, yet when you're taking this +1 concept, now, depending on the therapy, for instance, I do exposure treatment for OCD and anxiety. So sometimes we do go out on the field and do the exposure work. However, you're talking about, like a professional organization in terms of developing leadership qualities. And also some of that is actually involves being put in these meetings so that people can understand, what are some of the cultural messages that once I am in management, executive level, what that social dynamic looks like and what am I feeling, that what comes up. Just learning that, I think, is key. And you're also highlighting such an important piece, which is processing after the fact what that, I guess, activity or scenario was like for the person. And I would imagine, as many folks talked about, especially people of color, which is we don't see models. We don't see people at certain levels. So being in those spaces, just even navigating what that is like is so important.
That is absolutely right. I think the thing that we don't really appreciate oftentimes, especially within the realm of executive coaching or within organizations, is that when you move a person, it seems like right now upskilling and things of that nature is all trendy in the workplace, right? And that has an impact, right? It has an impact on a person's ability to get other jobs and to have more income or whatever that may be for them, which is great. But what we miss is that also changes a person. When you move them from one level to the next, that changes you. When you're gone from having a job on the loading dock to now being in leadership and maybe having to deal with the corporate headquarters, that's a different language, right? The rules are different. The etiquette is different. I know where I come from. I didn't come from that. So I had to learn through kind of jumping into the deep end and making mistakes along the way. It probably would have been easier if I had a model or some type of mentorship, which is why I've decided to do kind of the +1 to make it a little bit easier on other people. However, it changes. It changes how you talk. It changes how you think, how you handle conflict. As practitioners, no matter what your role is, there's no way for you to work with a person, right, and then not impact other areas of their lives. And we don't appreciate when we're asking a person to go from, in this scenario, the loading dock to even one ring up. That sets a trajectory. That's a personal transformation and not just a promotion.
Yeah. Organizations as a whole is I'm thinking about. It's not just the person or the therapist. I'm thinking as a society start thinking about systems. We need to start thinking about this differently. We promote people, sure, because of your performance. However, are we also thinking about, are we mentoring? Are we gearing, preparing? Because there's certain assumed skills that people have by nature.
There's a certain skill. So it's an ecosystem, right? There's no way to move something and not have a ripple effect. And so oftentimes there's a kind of a running joke, even as when I'm in my therapeutic role and I'm working with, regardless, let's say somebody in the C-suite, nobody knows that it's me behind the scenes that helping him to keep the company going. We don't quantify that in the way that, again, executive coaching industry does. We're very humble as practitioners and as therapists, which is great. The Achilles heel to that is we're very humble, and we don't necessarily quantify impact. And sometimes it's hard to quantify impact. And so there goes in, how do we make a business case for therapy? Because the work that I do with a client is going to have equally as much impact on how they show up at work as an executive coach does, but we don't promote that, right?
Yeah.
And so there is this thing that it is this ecosystem, and every work that I do, regardless of where they're at in that hierarchy, is that is going to have a ripple effect, because what I do will manifest itself in different ways in different areas of their life. And there's not, I don't think, a appreciation for the work that we do and how that impacts any employee. Because every client that you have, unless they are stay-at-home mom or unemployed or whatever, is impacting the company. When you're working with your OCD client and you're helping them with emotional regulation, it's just not like in this moment. Emotional regulation and things of that nature is something they embody, which helps them in, when they're triggered at work or triggered in the relationship. And so we, again, don't really necessarily optimize, vocalize, or quantify.
This is all interrelated. I like how you're really, really, bringing into the weeds of just not just, but how therapists are really helping folks create this ripple effect. And gosh, I mean, you're also shifting so many roles. You're working with organizations, you are working as a therapist, mentor. Oh, I'm thinking, how do you keep it straight in terms of what role do you take on? So I'm curious, do you have any other messages you like our listeners to key in on?
Yeah, I think the other key message is I think that is quite important, especially now, given the climate that we are in. Oftentimes my talks these days are making sure that we take care of leaders regardless of their color and their race or gender or anything of that nature. And they are taking care of their mental health, because they're going to be asked to do things that we're navigating uncharted territories for anything in our generation. And there's a lot to be put upon them. We do a really good job with employee well-being. We don't necessarily do the same for our leaders. And so I think of leaders as whole people. And I coach them. And when I give my talks, you are a whole person. We tend to romanticize, and they become caricatures or entities. And I'm like, you are a whole person who are also anxious, depressed, don't know what the answer is, grieving in the same way that we are grieving, but you also have shareholders and you have to hold it together. So being in a role can also be very isolating. And the research actually says, there's a little bit of research about there, not a whole lot for a lot of different reasons, but the research recently done, 2022, 2023, says employees expect leaders to be happy. And that the higher you are on the hierarchy and the more you make, the happier we think you should be. And we think you should have more resources because you can afford so. But that's not, you and I know as practitioners, that's not necessarily how that works. But that is a very hidden population that we don't really talk about. And so I have really just kind of been advocating for leaders that in this season, a lot is going to be put upon them. And to make sure you keep the company going, that you're going to have to make decisions that may go counter against what you say you value as a means to have survival and, keep the company going by any means necessary. And that, yes, your employee well-being is important. Absolutely. They're also whole people, and that their behavioral health is equally as important as those of theirs. And they're not made of armor, regardless of how we may perceive them. And so there has been kind of one of the messages that I've been trying to get out.
Wow. Thanks for sharing that message, especially now as many of folks are talking about dealing with tariffs. I'm just wondering how organizations handle that, or companies are handling that, especially small businesses such as, Black-owned or women-owned businesses. There are many businesses out there, and part of our podcast, People of Color in Psychology, is to talk about these diversity concerns, and particularly now when, let's say, we have minority-owned businesses. How are they handling this with their employees, also with themselves, the leaders that are running these organizations? So, Dr. Bullard, you've really done some extensive, phenomenal work in this area, and you're continuing to advocate and pushing for leadership to grow, pushing for opportunities so that there are also more people of color in leadership positions. So can you share with us any memorable events or circumstances that influenced how you got here?
Yes, I like to think of my career as a bit of a quilt. And by itself, they may seem random, right? Just random squares or random pieces, but there's a common theme, a thread that has kind of put all the way through. And so I actually started as within human resources. I did mergers and acquisitions, layoffs, things of that nature, helping companies restructure culture, things of that nature. I was advisors to executive and leadership teams. Through that, I decided that I wanted to pursue higher education and get my PhD in organizational psychology. I actually ended up going to my master's program in clinical psychology here in Georgia. I'm going to tie in and connect the dots from earlier in our conversation. I thought that in doing so that I could get just 2 years of a master's degree and then 3 years of a doctoral degree, and that equals the whole thing, because I come from a family of origin culture where I'm the only person that has ever pursued higher education at a graduate level. So clearly I was wrong. And so clearly that's not how that works.
No.
That's not how that works. So that really goes to, had I had someone in my life, my decisions would have been different. It doesn't necessarily mean it was the wrong decision, but I made it out of ignorance because I had no point of reference. There's no one else in my family. We're all professionals, but to this degree, I'm the only one, again, that has my graduate degree. There was no one else in my family like me. And so I had no one to kind of ask and kind of navigate that. And so I made a lot of mistakes and zigged when I should have zagged. So I ended up getting my master's in clinical psychology. I ended up practicing for a little bit, and that urge to say, well, yeah, this is great. And I'm working with clients from the Department of Corrections to psychiatric hospitals, private practice, academically and as an adjunct professor. But it's not fulfilling. The one thing that I wanted it to fulfill was working in organizations, because that's not at a master's level. That's not discipline. There's not really a practicum or internships that would allow for that. And so I felt that, yeah, although I love my job and I still do, there was a piece of me that's still missing. And I did not want to have to give up one side of me in order for the other side to thrive. And the only way that I could think of to make that work and marry my two disciplines and my two selves together was to say, okay, well, let me go back to school again, do another 5 years and become an organizational psychologist. And now I can blend my two disciplines. There are very few people that are practitioners and therapists that have a solid business background. And there are very few organizational psychologists that have ever been a practitioner at a therapeutic level. And so again, goes back to connecting dots to previous conversations. That gives me also a niche as I run my business. It allows me access to rooms. I am very much so both and. I don't pick and choose. It's not, are you an organizational psychologist or a psychotherapist? I'm an organizational psychologist and a psychotherapist. And that has its pluses and its minuses. In the organizations, they prize executive coaching over therapy. Again, that's for a lot of different reasons. And so that has its pluses and its minuses, but I did not want to limit. Everything informs. My work in organizations inform clearly my clients, and my clients inform how I see systems and relationships and dynamics, psychodynamically, family system-wise, inside of organizations. So everything is relevant. So I took the scenic route, but everything in this quilt, everything kind of goes together. It seems again random, but when you put them all together, you're like, oh, okay, now I can see the bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a big picture. It's such a comfortable quilt. You can just wrap it around the whole person. And I totally get it. I understand why your company, Becoming Point, does really address the whole development just based on what you shared with us, this development of your own trajectory. Totally makes sense. Now, as a person of color, and throughout this process, what were some challenges you faced and overcame that you would be willing to share?
I think one of the things that was a question that took me a while to really kind of think about, right? I share the same challenges as your previous guests have shared. I think the one that is not really talked about as much is being typecast. Because I'm a person of color, not only with people who are of different color than I am, but also within, being a person of color within the community. Everyone assumes that if you're a person of color, you specialize in DEI. Because we don't, what a leadership development and executive coach is, doesn't look necessarily like me. One, I'm a person of color. Two, I'm a female. And so when I come into the room and speak, there's an assumption about what I'm bringing into the room. And most people assume, regardless, that is going to be somewhat DEI related, and that's a great, and there's a space for that, and there's no problem with that, but that's not necessarily what I do. And so it creates this situation at times where I think I'm put into a box, or we can be put into a box and not allowed to be at other tables. Yeah, that's great. I believe in, diversity and all of that, but I also can talk about leadership development. I also can talk about, how we organize, culture and design organizations. And those conversations in the room, there are very few of us in there because it's not very common. Designing organizations, people and culture, things of that nature at a certain level, there's even fewer of us because people don't necessarily see us in the room or see us that way.
Yeah, you hit on a critical point here, because many people just assume that if you are a person of color in a business environment, you're there to address DEI, as opposed to, no, you're a person of color and you are in organizational management, organizational analysis, research. There's this, you are, I hope people hear this, and really challenge your assumptions and biases.
I'm a big believer in data analytics, all of those things, but that's not what people, that's not what people see. And again, I want to make sure that it's clear on both sides. Even within my community of people of color, the same assumption is made.
That's the internalized bias that we all have. We're all going through a journey together. And right. I think the beauty is recognizing that, growing up in these systems, this is just what we see. And so we internalize it. And so it is so important to question this. Thank you.
It is very much. It is so much. And so moving outside of that box, and I've given up speaking opportunities. I've given up projects that, would have paid good money. But I had to, at some point, to say, if I do that, then that is what I'm going to be known for. And that's not my lane. And I don't want other people's influence what my lane is. And so, and really having to make some really tough decisions about and say, no, I deserve to be, I develop leaders. I have every right to be in that room. And I'm going to say no to this opportunity. The opportunity I want needs to be this, and demand as much.
Wow. Not many people can say that. I mean, to give up speaking engagements because there's a recognition, I'm not going to be typecast as the person who does DEI and suddenly become this trajectory of only doing DEI work. I need something fulfilling. Right. And then to take this path of, wait, I'm doing data analytics. That's what you do in terms of research as an IL psychologist.
Absolutely. I refer you to, I have many clients or many colleagues that I can refer you to. But then that comes down to say, if I felt that if I said yes, again, that's going to be the next gig and the next gig and the next gig. And I'm like, I did not want to be put into that box. And so what is it to be the only person in the room who's or one of few people in the room who does data analytics, who does research and all of that. And I didn't necessarily realize I had an affinity for research until I got to my dissertation. But again, there was nobody else like me. And so now I am being in a room where sometimes I'm the only person in the room and still able to hold my own and recognize that I have a presence, I have thoughts, and things of that nature, robust discussion, not just because I'm a person of color, true, not just because I'm a female, true. I'm also from in a hierarchy, social hierarchy, a different social class. All of those things inform what we think about diversity, what do we think about what it means to be in a room. And so all of those, I'm very strategic and I'm very intentional. I try to coach my clients or guide my clients in that we ground ourselves in clarity and we move with intention. And my clarity is I know who I am and who I'm not. I know what I am and what I'm not, unapologetically, without needing to explain it, without needing to justify it.
Wow. Dr. Bullard, this is such a powerful, enlightening conversation. I mean, I'm just basking in this. I mean,
Oh,
thank you so much for being on, our episode today, and having this beautiful conversation. So, and thinking about this, oh God, I'm in awe right now, just really
oh, thank
in your
you.
message. So, I'm thinking about for you, what does it mean to be a Black IO psychologist?
Uh, I am aware that I carry a lot on my back from a lot of different places, right? It means that the opportunity to have a voice in a conversation to get people to say, huh, you know, the stereotypes, the assumptions is part of human nature, all those things when we connect with a person. Like when you talk to her and I see it, there is a kind of a responsibility and accountability that comes with that, with being Black IO psychologist, right? It is to give voice to things that other people have not considered because they can't. They don't have, there's no way for them to be and have no feelings about that. There's no way for, it would be just the same as you have no concept of what it is you can relate because ethnically we're minorities, we're people of color. So there's a certain way you can empathize, but you don't know what it is like to be a Black, psychologist or a Black female psychologist. One of the things that I had an interesting conversation with a different colleague, I also believe in Black allyship. I have a client who is in this time, is a white female who after the election was really struggling with the outcome. And we were working through what that means. And I had to, again, pick a lane. Am I going to be therapist, mentor, or coach? Or am I going to ethically take that off and just have one conversation from Staci to the client? And I said, people are going to look at you because you're a blonde white woman, and they're going to make assumptions which side of the fence you're on. And so people are going to judge you by your skin and what they think that they know about you. And so there's going to be a lot of hostility coming at you, fair or unfair. So here's really two really good opportunities for you. As a Black ally to a white woman, we think of allyship in reverse, right? But as a Black ally to a white woman, here's a really good opportunity to have a life experience, to get as close as you're probably going to get to the empathy of what it's like to be judged by the color of your skin and what people think that they know about you just by the way that you look and the assumptions people make, fair or unfair. But it is also a really good time for you to reckon with what it means to have privilege and whiteness. And my job is not to put my stuff up on you, because that's my stuff, race, racial inequality. That comes into play as context as you're working through your stuff and on your journey. But that's, my racial, inequalities and history and all of that is not to be imposed upon you. And really having to navigate, that is also what that means to be a Black practitioner. How do I work with somebody who has a different historical context, who is also, and seeing them in hurt and working through their grief and being safe enough to ask questions and be an ally. And we don't talk about what that means to be a Black ally to others as much or as ever. But that is also my responsibility as a Black psychologist, is to say, okay, the allyship, I practice allyship out of love and fairness to everyone. And I have to be safe for everyone. And what is mine and what is not is not. And she is hurting and she is grieving and she needs context to recognize what her privilege and the whiteness and how these things come to be about. That was not the time for a rant about the unfairness and DEI and all of that. That's not what she's looking for, and being in that supportive role and being able to walk that line. That is my responsibility. I have voice, but that voice comes with being really careful because words have weight.
I mean, there's so much wisdom and care as you're describing this interaction. There's a space where you're holding the pressure of being a Black psychologist and also the profession and also navigating, wait, this client is coming to me for help. How can I be effective and not, for example, authentic? And it's such a beautiful interaction to say, hey, this is how it can come across, and being empathetic to really, I think as you're describing this interaction, it's about discrimination and bias based on the color of the skin. And if we can't even
Yes,
address, yes, that idea doesn't care what color. And
it does.
so it doesn't. So if we are really, really true to the idea of challenging stereotypes and biases, we must do the allyship the other direction, as you mentioned.
Correct. But you and I both know that comes with
Repercussion.
It
Yes.
comes with repercussions. That's not necessarily kind of cheered upon, in certain circles.
Yes.
And I got it. So, there's backlash, and there might be comments and feedbacks in this video in regards to it. But I have taken that on to your point, to your question. That is what that means to me, a Black psychologist. It's the same thing in reverse. And I'm just saying, people are going to judge you by the color of your skin.
Wow.
Because we think,
you're also not. Well, you're not dismissing that this particular client has privilege, and you've made it clear. Here's a way, this comes with privilege, where your stance, again, this is probably the closest you can get. And that is true. And so I think, wow, it's amazing. I mean, so much wisdom in these interactions. Gosh, oh my gosh. Again, I am in awe with this conversation. So, Dr. Bullard, I mean, all the things that you have to navigate, the different roles, the wisdom, the insights. I'm curious for our listeners, how can we support you?
Well, I'm really glad that you asked that. One of the ways, of course, I'm always open to clients. So now that I've done a really good job of setting up the avatar, what the ideal client is, I'm always open for clients. I have a very niche practice. I have a very small practice. It's very intimate as it relates to that. I work because most of my clients are high-level professionals or up-and-coming. I have Saturday hours, and I do a little bit of concierge for people who have non-traditional situations. And so that part, I'm always open for clients. But more importantly, actually, these days, I'm seeing less clients, and I'm taking on more projects. So I am also, if you're willing to collaborate, if you have a project, I've written some curriculum for the city of Atlanta and their leadership development. They're piloting some new things for law enforcement, and how do we, and everything that's been going on, how do we train law enforcement? And so I've been working on that. I'm always open for research opportunities. So in this space, it's not really the clients. The clients will take care of themselves. As more so of me seeking out opportunities like you and I to have conversations, but also in collaboration to say, hey, there's this project, would you like to partner on? Or, hey, you brought up these topics. This might sound like a really good research project. We're working on this at the University of what so-and-so. Would you mind, because you are a practitioner and a scholar, would you mind coming in because you have a lens that we don't already have? And that's how I got connected with the University of North Carolina. They had a they didn't necessarily have a practitioner to say, hey, this is really good writing, but it's not practical. That's not how leaders think, and that's not how they navigate the day-to-day. And so those are the opportunities that I'm actually seeking at this point.
Got it. I'll definitely keep an ear open to some of those ideas and opportunities too. But gosh, I mean, working with the city and drafting these, curriculums and training programs for law enforcement, I mean, it's a huge undertaking and makes such a big change for the city. So, Dr. Bullard, thank you so much for the insights, the practical elements in terms of what therapists really need to be listening to with their clients, and also thinking more complexly about leadership, as well as considering executive coaching for their clients. And even just personally, for all of us, as we are going through our own racial development and journey and exploration, how we can challenge even within the profession. When we see certain people based on the color of their skin, are we assuming certain qualities, skills, essentially typecast in certain roles? I mean, there's so many, wisdom, so many gold moments in today's conversation. So I truly appreciate it.
You're absolutely welcome. I would be more than welcome to have another conversation and keep this conversation. And perhaps we can do this again and chat again.
Yes. Well, Dr. Bullard, we would love to have you back on a future episode. Thank you so much for your time today. A huge thank you to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please share and subscribe to People of Color in Psychology. You can also support us by registering for continuing education courses or making a one-time donation on the Multicultural Counseling Institute's website. Your feedback is important to us, so feel free to send an email, a message on LinkedIn, or leave a voice message on our website. Until next time, this is your host, Jack Sun.